Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kraft, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 17 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics regarding those two positions, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends and quarterbacks so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 17, the championship weekend. On top of that, we'll go ahead and continue into talking about my top 16 tight end and quarterback rankings. I'll share with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings. For those of you looking for a specific tight end or quarterback, be sure to travel down to the description of the video. Down there, you can find timestamps for each individual player. Thank you very much. While you're down there, you can also go ahead and check out the link traveling on over to Underdog Fantasy. At the end of today's episode, I'll be traveling on over and putting together a couple pick'em slips. So for those of you who are trying to potentially follow, you can go ahead, sign up today using code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of $10, because not only will you get the first time deposit match up to $100, but you'll get my rankings for this upcoming Sunday and the following Sunday. All-encompassing rankings, half PPR, full PPR, by position, flex rankings, all of that for the remainder of the season. So for those of you who are interested, be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. And if you sign up before Saturday's game between the Dallas Cowboys and Detroit Lions, you can take advantage of the new customer special of Dak Prescott 0.5 total yards. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about tight end matchups going into Week 17. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have tight end matchups isolated from weeks 5 through 16 in terms of receiving statistics allowed by defenses. Therefore, the Denver Broncos, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Cincinnati Bengals, they have given up the most fantasy points per game based on receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns in a half PPR scoring format. So, of course, we want to take advantage of those matchups. Guys like Gerald Everett, even though he's not the biggest name tight end, he still has himself a great opportunity taking on a defense such as the Denver Broncos, who's given up a lot of fantasy points to many of tight ends over the course of this entire season. Either way, just wanted to go ahead and present some of the more advantageous matchup. As we typically do, we also want to talk about some of the more disadvantageous matchups, but I will refer back to all of these statistics over the course of today's video when I find it applicable in regards to talking about these tight ends. So let's go ahead. Let's transition into talking about my top 16 tight end rankings, beginning with our number one. It is Travis Kelce. Now, when we're talking about matchups, Travis Kelce has one of the most advantageous ones going into this week. The third best, in fact, playing against the Cincinnati Bengals, who are allowing 12.41 fantasy points per game. Based on DVOA, they're the second best matchup at the tight end position over the course of this entire season. Over the course of the last 4 games in which Travis Kelce has taken on the Cincinnati Bengals, whether that's the regular season or the postseason, he has scored 3 touchdowns in those 4 games. My expectation is a bounce-back performance here, and hopefully, for those of you who still have Travis Kelce in your lineup, even though he has had underwhelming performances as of late, hopefully he can come through and help us capture a championship. All right, moving on to our number 2, we have Trey McBride of the Arizona Cardinals to close out the S tier. Since Week 8, the Philadelphia Eagles, who they'll be taking on, have struggled against the tight end position. Most recently, they've given up 6 catches, 75 to New York Giants tight ends, 5 for 72 to Dallas tight ends, 4 for 68 to San Francisco, 744 and a touchdown to Kansas City, 891 and a touchdown to Dallas again, and of course 7 for 61 and a touchdown to Washington tight ends. Tight ends have found themselves a lot of success against this defense. So as long as we have Trey McBride on the field, healthy, ready to go, of course Kyler Murray, which is the huge part of his overall potential for success, especially considering in the last 5 games that they have played together. Of course, Trey McBride's averaging 8.83 targets per game. So hopefully Kyler, he's dealing with an illness. He'll be ready to go by Sunday. Marquise Hollywood-Brown has been sent to the injured reserve. On top of that, over the course of the last 3 games, wide receivers on this team have combined for 4, and 2 receptions in the last 3 games. Pretty ridiculously low numbers. So, of course, Trey McBride expected to have himself a great performance against a defense that currently is the number 6 overall matchup based on DVOA. Should be a solid week for Trey McBride. Number 3, we have George Kittle. George Kittle is pretty much one of those guys that you blindly start every single week because you know he has the potential of being the number 1 tight end by the end of the week, just as long as he's given opportunity. Last week had himself a huge load of opportunity, had himself 10 targets, 7 catches for 126 receiving yards. Now, with Brock Purdy, prior to, of course, Purdy leaving with the injury, had 7 targets, 5 catches, 111 receiving yards, and was dominating with 13.6 fantasy points. I'm expecting him to get back to that trend of overall success, taking on the Washington Commanders, whose secondary has been struggling all season long. Our number 4 is Evan Engram, the thumbnail of today's episode. Evan Engram has the opportunity of playing with C.J. Beathard as his quarterback this week. Of course, Trevor Lawrence dealing with, the concussion protocol from a week before. Then he obviously, hurt his shoulder this last week. So with Trevor Lawrence inactive, of course, we have C.J. Beathard, who has already shown thus far this season in the 2 games in which he has come in the relief of Trevor Lawrence that he loves to target Evan Engram. earlier this season against the Cincinnati Bengals in that Monday night game. Of course, CJ Beathard came into the game when Trevor Lawrence left with the ankle injury. In that game, CJ Beathard had 10 passing attempts, 4 of which went in the direction of Evan Engram, a 40% target share. Then you go back to last week's performance in the absence of Trevor Lawrence. 15 total passing attempts for CJ Beathard, 8 in the direction of Evan Engram. So as long as he's going to continue to get a high volume of opportunity, this is the number 4 overall matchup based on DVOA for the tight end position. I'm expecting Evan Engram to have himself another successful performance. Number 5, we have Sam LaPorta to close out the A tier. In any given week, Sam LaPorta can come away with 2-3 touchdowns. It's always possible. That's why we have to continue to start him. And I understand that last week's performance, 3 catches for 18 yards, quite underwhelming. But you also have to take into account that this offense had 3 rushing touchdowns, 2 to Jahmyr Gibbs and 1 to David Montgomery. So if you're going to have those kind of scenarios where in a given week, they're going to be rushing for a high volume of overall touchdowns, your wide receivers are going to suffer because of that. So in this given week, hopefully, against the Dallas Cowboys, the 7th best matchup based on DVOA, we could be in a position where Sam LaPorta should find himself a pretty good volume of overall targets and hopefully success. Last week, Durham Smythe for the Miami Dolphins, even though he is not a big name tight end and isn't utilized very much outside of blocking, he was a focal point of that offense early on. Had himself 5 receptions for 56 yards. The Miami Dolphins pinpointed something that they wanted to exploit. Hopefully, the Detroit Lions will continue to accentuate upon that going into this week. Number 6, we have Dalton Schultz. This week, they take on the Tennessee Titans. Back in week 15, they had an opportunity of taking on the same matchup. In that game, Dalton Schultz with Case Keenum at quarterback. 5 targets, 4 catches, 58 receiving yards, 7.8 fantasy points. Now, amongst all total Houston tight ends within that game, they combined for 6 catches for 67. So a pretty successful overall week within the overall matchup, even though technically it's the most difficult matchup based on fantasy points allowed since week 5. But with CJ Stroud returning to the lineup and no longer having guys like Case Keenum or Davis Mills under center. I mean, with Davis Mills and Case Keenum last week, Dalton Schultz still had himself 11 targets, 8 catches, 61 receiving yards, a great overall performance. But with CJ Stroud, the entire offense elevates. They have more potential for touchdowns. And I truly do believe that Dalton Schultz within the overall contest should have himself a lot of overall usage and success. Number 7, we have Cole Kmet. From weeks 14 through 16, the last 3 games, Cole Kmet has been the number 7 overall tight end in fantasy football, which of course continues to keep him right on track being the number 7 tight end on today's list, considering he's been averaging over 10 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time, getting himself a lot of usage, coming off another week in which he had himself a great performance, 107 overall receiving yards, and 4 receptions in a game in which he left with an injury. So if in fact he's fully ready to go, which is the anticipation going into this week's contest against the Atlanta Falcons, a defense that gave up 9 receptions and 109 receiving yards to Colts tight ends last week, you would assume that Cole Kmet could put up a pretty solid performance this week. Number 8, we have Jake Ferguson of the Dallas Cowboys. Jake Ferguson, last week, 4 catches, 45, pretty much the expectation. Unless he scores a touchdown, he's pretty much going to be a 4-catch, 45-yard kind of guy. Even though he's had 4 consecutive weeks of 8+ targets, he's not able to catch the vast majority of the overall opportunities sent in his direction. Luckily, this week, they take on the Detroit Lions, who most recently gave up 6 catches for 114 receiving yards to Minnesota Vikings tight ends. Obviously, that was with TJ Hawkinson, and then after TJ Hawkinson left the game, a little bit of Josh Oliver, but either way, there is a potential here in which Jake Ferguson can find himself some success. It's just a matter of, does he find himself in the end zone? Hopefully he finds himself scoring a touchdown. Number 9, we have Isaiah Likely. Very similar to Cole Kmet, in which we just talked about. As of late, this is another tight end that has found themselves a lot of success. In the last 4 games without Mark Andrews in the lineup, we have seen Isaiah Likely averaging 11.35 fantasy points per game. Again, a lot of success over the course of the last couple weeks. Some performances in which he only puts up 7 points, others in which he finds himself in the end zone, scores 17 points. But the middle ground is what we're looking for, and hopefully he can find that against the Miami Dolphins. Isaiah Likely, since Mark Andrews has gone down with that injury, is the number 2 overall receiving threat within this offense in terms of overall receptions. He is ahead of Odell Beckham, Rashad Bateman, Nelson Aguilar, everyone, only behind Zay Flowers in terms of overall receptions, and not by that much. I think it's like 21 to 17. So as long as he's in the number 2 receiving option, one of the best offenses in the league, Isaiah Likely, a must-start play in a top 10 option. Speaking of number 10, we have Dallas Goedert, who's taking on the Arizona Cardinals. One of the better matchups. Most recently, again, Cole Kmet, 4 catches, 107. Mark Andrews, 4 for 40 and a touchdown. David Njoku, 4 for 26 and a touchdown. Schultz scored a touchdown. Higbee scored 2 touchdowns. So why not Dallas Goedert? A tight end who has had himself back-to-back games of 9+ targets. Again, that kind of target share is ridiculously high. Coming off a game in which he had 7 catches for 71 receiving yards. All while Devontae Smith on that team is coming off of back-to-back games of only 5 total targets. So if they continue to utilize Dallas Goedert at this capacity, Jalen Hurts continues to go in his direction. Of course, he's an automatic start in this overall week. It's the 3rd best matchup based on DVOA thus far this season. Number 11 to close out the B tier. Again, there are a lot of B tier tight ends because all of them could very easily score a touchdown and make their week. And they're all capable of doing so based on the opportunity they are given. But in the case of Hunter Henry, in week 14, 3 catches, 40 and 2 touchdowns. Week 15, 7 catches, 66 and 1 touchdown. He had himself back-to-back performances of over 16 fantasy points, scoring a touchdown in back-to-back games. Fantastic. In his absence last week against the Denver Broncos, Mike Gesicki, the backup tight end, scored a touchdown for the New England Patriots offense. We know for a fact, based on what we have seen, that Bailey Zappi loves to utilize his tight ends. And going against the Buffalo Bills, if Hunter Henry is healthy, ready to go with an knee injury, I expect him to find success and hopefully find the end zone. Number 12, we have Darren Waller. Darren Waller last week, obviously with the quarterback change, found himself a little bit more success in the second half in comparison to when he had, Tommy DeVito. Earlier this season with Tyrod Taylor, that is the best overall Darren Waller that we have seen because he's seen more opportunity. And of course, that was when he was at his healthiest. So going into this week with another week under his belt off of the injury, hopefully Darren Waller can take advantage of the opportunity against the LA Rams. The LA Rams are allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game, 11.85 per game since week 5 to opposing tight ends. Most recently, 5 catches, 61 and a touchdown to New Orleans tight ends. 5 catches, 83 and a touchdown to Baltimore tight ends. 8 catches, 72 and a touchdown to Cleveland tight ends, and 8 catches for 86 to Arizona tight ends. Those are just the most recent 4 games. Tight ends find a lot of success against the LA Rams, so why not Darren Waller this week? Moving on to 13, we have Gerald Everett, who has literally the best matchup at the tight end position. They're allowing nearly 14 fantasy points per game, and they are also the number 1 overall matchup based on DVOA for the entirety of this season. Over the course of the last 3 games with Easton Stick as his quarterback, Gerald Everett has had 8+ targets in each of those 3 contests. He's coming off a week in which he had 7 catches for 42 receiving yards. In a full PPR, probably finds himself being a little bit more valuable in comparison to being, half PPR standard play because of the lack of overall potential for a touchdown within his overall performance. Nonetheless, Gerald Everett, a pretty solid play going into this week. Let's move on to the D tier. We have Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts, even though he had himself 3 catches, 49 and a touchdown last week, let's just put this into perspective. Geno Smith last week still out-targeted him. 6 targets, 4 receptions, 32 receiving yards. And even earlier this season, in the game in which Taylor Heineke started at the quarterback position, in that same game, Kyle Pitts was out-targeted and out-used by Geno Smith. In that game, Geno Smith, 6 targets, 5 catches, 100 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So be very careful with Kyle Pitts. Let's hope he finds success because they are playing against the 8th best matchup at the position, allowing over 11 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. But Geno Smith could very easily dig into his overall workload this week. Moving on to Chigoziem Okonkwo for the Tennessee Titans. Last week had himself a receiving touchdown with Derrick Henry. Fantastic. We'll take it. He has had himself 6+ targets in 3 of the last 4 games. They take on the Houston Texans, which is one of the best matchups you could possibly ask for. 9 receptions, 68 and a touchdown by Cleveland tight ends. 7 catches, 94 from New York Jets tight ends. 8 catches, 104 from Jacksonville Jaguars tight ends. Again, a lot of potential for success going into the given week, especially coming off of a great overall performance from week 16. Speaking of 16, we have the final tight end I wanted to mention, Tucker Kraft. Earlier today, we were given a designation that Luke Musgrave, who is coming off of the injured reserve because of the kidney laceration that he suffered earlier this season, is most likely doubtful to play. On top of that, Christian Watson's most likely not going to play. I know that Dontavion Wicks is going to be like a game-time decision. We know that Jaden Reed is going to be active, but with so many other receiving threats inactive going into this week, we have to remember that Tucker Kraft, from weeks 12 through 16, in the absence of Luke Musgrave, has been averaging 8.76 fantasy points per game in the last 5 contests in his absence. So he is a pretty solid play as our number 16. All right, with that all covered, let's go ahead and move on and let's talk about quarterbacks, beginning with matchups. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have quarterback fantasy points allowed in terms of passing statistics, passing yards, passing touchdowns, and interceptions. Of course, this is a 4-point per passing touchdown kind of format. So giving all this information, the Washington Commanders, Philadelphia Eagles, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Jacksonville Jaguars, LA Rams, etc., are the most advantageous matchups you could possibly ask for going into the given week based on the success that they have allowed to opposing quarterbacks from weeks 5 through 16. Now, on the other end of this overall spectrum, we have the Jets and the Browns, who last night, of course, were the better matchups at the quarterback position, but boy, did they give up some points to Joe Flacco in the first half of that game. Yes, he didn't have to throw to his wide receivers, but David Njoku, Jerome Ford, they stepped up to the task at hand. I know that, Elijah Moore, prior to the concussion, found himself success, but either way, it is not impossible to find success against difficult matchups. It was proven last night by Joe Flacco. So, with this all taken into account, let's go ahead and let's talk about my top 16 quarterback rankings. Beginning with our number 1, of course, it is Jalen Hurts. What makes Jalen Hurts special for fantasy purposes is his upside on the ground. I mean, besides the fact that they take on the Arizona Cardinals, who are the 7th best matchup at the quarterback position in terms of passing statistics isolated, they're allowing 15.5 fantasy points per game in that category. Thus far this season, Jalen Hurts has scored 15 rushing touchdowns in 15 games. So just putting that into perspective, whenever you have a 6-point influx on top of any sort of yardage he's going to gain, and any sort of extra potential in which he scores maybe 2 rushing touchdowns within a game, of course, he is an automatic play in every single circumstance. On number 2, we have Josh Allen, who very similar to Jalen Hurts, has scored a lot of rushing touchdowns this season, 13 to be exact, coming off a week in which he scored 2 rushing touchdowns, stolen away from guys like James Cook, Latavius Murray, etc. Either way, Josh Allen, as of late, even though he hasn't had very many passing attempts, he is still able to get it done through the air. 237 last week in a passing touchdown. But the rushing yardage and the rushing touchdowns definitely making a huge difference. This week they take on the New England Patriots, a division rival. In the last 2 games against the New England Patriots, in both of those games, he's been able to score himself 3 or more touchdowns, 24.3 fantasy points, 21.76, an automatic play in a division rival matchup in which they're very familiar with. Number 3 to begin the 8th tier is Dak Prescott. They take on the Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions are the 8th best matchup at the quarterback position, allowing over 15.3 fantasy points per game in terms of passing statistics isolated. On top of that, they're a top 5 matchup at the wide receiver position, where mainly that is exactly where Dak Prescott benefits because of the overall upside of guys like CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, Brandon Cooks, etc. So going into the game, with one of the better matchups and the fact that Dak Prescott, even though he had himself a lackluster performance a couple weeks back against the Buffalo Bills, I do expect him to play a lot better at home this week. 9 of his last 10 games have accounted for 2 or more touchdowns scored. Should be a solid overall play. Number 4, we have Lamar Jackson, who's coming off another great week, 22.58 fantasy points. And what I noticed is that as soon as Mark Andrews went down with the injury, Lamar Jackson improved as a quarterback in terms of fantasy purposes. Thus far, over the course of the last, I'd say 6 games, weeks 11 through 16, without Mark Andrews, we have seen Lamar Jackson averaging 22.34 fantasy points per game. While earlier this season, from weeks 2 through 10, with Mark Andrews in the lineup, averaging only 17.66 fantasy points per game. That's nearly a 5-point jump in terms of overall fantasy production. As long as that continues, taking on the Miami Dolphins this week, we know that Lamar always likes to step up against the Miami Dolphins. Florida is his home state. He should have himself a fantastic overall performance within the matchup. Number 5, we have Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy had his worst possible game he could have potentially put forth last week, and hopefully we never see that again. 4 interceptions is brutal. Some of them were unlucky. Some of them were just bad passes. Either way, he still has 5 of the last 7 games in which he has participated in which he has been a top 6 quarterback for fantasy purposes within those given weeks. So again, as of late, has been far better than worse, and hopefully you've been able to survive, your fantasy overall playoffs, even though he put up a 2-point performance last week. This week, they take on the best matchup at the quarterback position, taking on the Washington Commanders. I'm expecting a monster performance and a bounce-back game here for Brock Purdy. Number 6, to close out the 8th tier, is Justin Fields. Justin Fields, weeks 11 through 16, he's been able to have himself 9.36 fantasy points per game, just off of rushing statistics isolated. Since coming back from his injury, nearly 10 fantasy points per game just off rushing stats. Whenever you can go ahead and have yourself that much upside on a given weekly basis, very similar to Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, and of course Lamar Jackson, that's all we can ask for. He's going to continue to get it done on the ground through the air. I know that the Atlanta Falcons matchup is a little bit more difficult than the Arizona Cardinals from last week, but I do expect them to find success within the given week. Number 7, coming off of his injury and has missed each of the last 2 games, we have CJ Stroud. Now, besides CJ Stroud returning, the last time that he was playing and he was active, he didn't have Tank Dell. He didn't have a healthy Nico Collins. Noah Brown was not healthy, and neither was Dalton Schultz. So now with CJ Stroud returning and all of his surrounding pieces are healthy and ready to go, I expect CJ Stroud to get back to being a very successful quarterback. I mean, prior to him getting injured, this was a guy that was a top 12 quarterback every single week for fantasy purposes in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. So I expect him to find that level of success. Last time out against the Tennessee Titans earlier this season in week 15, it was Case Keenum as a starting quarterback. Still, Case Keenum in that game, 229 passing yards and a passing touchdown. I would assume that CJ Stroud is capable of like a 280-yard, 2-3 passing touchdown game and finding himself a lot of success within the given week. Number 8, we have Matthew Stafford, one of these quarterbacks who's been on fire as of late. He's been able to throw 14 passing touchdowns in the last 5 games with only 1 interception. Over the course of the last 5 games, he's been able to be the number 6, 8, 5, 12, and 9 overall quarterback for fantasy purposes. I think the number 8 spot in the given week taking on the New York Giants is a fantastic play. I'm expecting him to go for his 300 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. I heard a little bit of a whisper that Puka Nacua is dealing with a little bit of an injury, but based on what we heard from the press conference from Sean McVay, the head coach of the Los Angeles Rams, is that this injury will not impact his status for Sunday. Should be ready to go and fired up. So, of course, we're firing on Matthew Stafford, considering all the weapons he has surrounding him. Number 9, we have Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield has been incredible as of late. Last week in my rankings video, I had him way higher than where I had him on Saturday and Sunday, and I honestly made a mistake. I think I overthought the entire situation. I had him ranked perfectly high, and then I moved him down because I got scared. But either way, going into this week, there's no fear taking on the New Orleans Saints defense that has struggled a lot as of late. And even earlier this season, Baker Mayfield torched this defense. He put up 246 and 3 passing touchdowns against this defense, 22.94 fantasy points against the New Orleans Saints, in a week in which earlier this season, week 4, Mike Evans left the game due to an injury. So with all pieces ready to go, an enhanced running game in comparison to last time these two teams faced, especially considering, of course, this defense cannot stop the run. I'm expecting Baker Mayfield to find himself a lot of success. Most recently, the actual good quarterbacks that have taken on this defense, like Stafford, Goff, Minshew, Stroud, Dobbs, they have all gone for 2+ passing touchdowns. All the other quarterbacks that are backups and not great players, they have gone ahead and had themselves the bad performances against the New Orleans Saints, like a Tommy DeVito as of late. Number 10, we have Patrick Mahomes taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. If Mason Rudolph can take on this defense, put up 290 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns, why not Patrick Mahomes? Truly, I think Patrick Mahomes needs to get back on track, especially before the playoffs. Hopefully, he can go ahead and have himself a solid performance here. Last week, 10 rushes for 53 rushing yards. If he can continue that, he's going to be relevant for fantasy purposes. But based on just watching the game last week, the Cincinnati Bengals defense looks slow. Patrick Mahomes can take advantage of this, and hopefully he can have himself a bounce-back performance here. Number 11, we have Kyler Murray to close out the C tier. I mentioned it earlier today in regards to talking about Trey McBride. If, in fact, Kyler Murray is not at 100% health, he may end up missing this game because of the illness that he's dealing with. But if, in fact, he plays, the Eagles are the second best matchup at the position, allowing 17.6 fantasy points per game, and they've most recently given up a lot of points to opposing teams that have been led by Tyrod Taylor for, a little bit more than half the game, and Drew Lock. So if backup quarterbacks can go up against the Philadelphia Eagles and put up great performances, why not Kyler Murray within the given week? Even with all the receiver injuries that he's dealing with, he still has his tight ends that he, of course, continues to pepper in terms of targets. Number 12, we have Jared Goff, who takes on the Dallas Cowboys. I do expect Jared Goff to be a little bit better this week. Hopefully he can get back to his 250 yards, 240 yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Unfortunately, last week, again, Jahmyr Gibbs, 2 rushing touchdowns, and David Montgomery also had himself a rushing touchdown. If it wasn't for the fact that Jared Goff threw a 1-yard passing touchdown to Amon-Ra St. Brown, there could have very easily been a game last week in which he threw for 0 touchdowns. That's just the nature of the beast in regards to this offense, but nonetheless, I do expect against the Dallas Cowboys, indoors, ready to go, controlled weather environment, for him to have another solid fantasy performance in a matchup in which, again, is a must-win for the NFC side of the overall playoff conversation. Moving on to our number 13, we have Jordan Love. Jordan Love, in 6 of his last 7 games that he has played, has been able to surpass 2 or more touchdowns scored, whether it's on the ground through the air. This week, we already got a confirmation that Jaden Reed is expected to play, which is fantastic, especially considering he's become one of his favorite options through the receiving game over the course of the last couple of weeks in the absence of Christian Watson. Last time out against the Minnesota Vikings earlier this year, they lost 24-10. This is a tough defense to play against. So it's purely going to be on the shoulders of Jordan Love to carry this team. Hopefully he'll be able to do so with all the receiving threats that he has available to him. Again, a lot of them dealing with injuries, but I wouldn't put it past Jordan Love to have himself a solid performance within the given week. Number 14, we have Geno Smith. Honestly, I don't trust the Pittsburgh Steelers defense or team as a whole. Sure, maybe they have the Cincinnati Bengals number. That's why they've played them close or blown them out most recently as of late. But I think Geno Smith and the boys could honestly put up a solid performance here, especially considering, the Steelers defense and the Steelers team that gave up 3 passing touchdowns to Gardner Minshew and, of course, Bailey Zappi, they're still in there and they can absolutely be exploited. I think that's what's going to happen. I think Geno Smith is going to be able to put up a solid performance. Hopefully he gets himself his 220, 240 passing or 2 passing touchdowns and has himself another solid performance here within the given week. Number 15, we have Derek Carr. 3 consecutive games of 2+ touchdowns. Again, last week was a lot of garbage time, but we're probably going to find ourselves with a lot of garbage time this week, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, whose offense has been a buzzsaw. As a team, they've been able to score, 28+ points in 3 consecutive games. You're going to have to keep up with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, so hopefully Derek Carr and the garbage time doesn't go away this week. Number 16, the final quarterback I wanted to mention is Jake Browning. I understand that he had himself a lackluster performance last week. Still had 330 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown. Sure, threw 3 interceptions, and that's tough. But with Jamar Chase potentially coming back, that is the contingency. If Jamar Chase is active, I'm confident playing Jake Browning within the given week against the Kansas City Chiefs. If Jamar Chase is inactive, then I'll go ahead and I'll find another quarterback to play. That is going to cover it for today's episode in regards to quarterback and tight end rankings. Let's close out today's episode by putting together a couple pick'em subs via Underdog Fantasy. Again, link down in the description. Use code Andrew. Make that first-time deposit today to not only get, of course, the first-time deposit match, be able to get the overall new customer play of Dak Prescott 0.5 total yards, but get my rankings for this upcoming weekend and the following weekend to close out the season strong and capture a 2023 Fantasy Football Championship. So let's go ahead, let's transition and put together some slips right now. So going into this week, I have a couple plays that I honestly prefer. So let me go ahead and let's look a couple of these up. Josh Allen is a player that has kind of popped off as of late for me, and we talked about it just a moment ago. Josh Allen this season has scored quite literally 13 rushing touchdowns. Last week, 2 rushing touchdowns. But as of late, I mean, just talking about the consistency, in 11 of the last 13 games he has played, he has scored a rushing touchdown. That's an 85% success rate in that overall category. Anytime they get near the goal line, of course, he's finding himself scoring a rushing touchdown as they don't really trust to give it to guys like James Cook. Nonetheless, I would go ahead and lean in the direction of potentially firing up Josh Allen for him rushing a touchdown. Now, I want to check. Does Jalen Hurts have a rushing touchdown prop here? Let's see here. No, he does not. So they trust that it's almost a guarantee that he's going to score it. Obviously, there's been 2 circumstances this season. Again, 11 of the last 13 games in which Josh Allen hasn't scored a rushing touchdown. But again, not a bad play. Now, in that same game, I honestly want to talk about Ezekiel Elliott. His current number is 4.5 receptions. Over the course of the last, 3 games, in the absence of Ramondre Stevenson, his reception counts have been 7, 5, and 9. In a game against the Buffalo Bills, I would assume they're going to be throwing the ball for majority of this game. Earlier this season, sure, the New England Patriots were able to find themselves victorious against this defense, but Ramondre Stevenson, even in that game, 6 receptions. So I would assume that Ezekiel Elliott should be able to surpass this cute number of 4.5 receptions. I don't know why I called it a cute number. I just think it's very easily attainable for him going into the given week based on his usage and, of course, his target count that he has had as coming off a week of 11 targets, 9 catches. I think 4.5 receptions is a pretty solid number that he should be able to achieve. Now, another player that I like is DeAndre Swift. Oop, that's not how you spell Swift. Come on, there it is. Oh, there it is. Okay. So here's the thing about DeAndre Swift. His current number is at 69.5 rushing yards. I think that number is way too low in comparison to where it should be, especially considering the matchup on hand. I have DeAndre Swift ranked as my number 4 overall running back on the week for a reason. Against the Arizona Cardinals running backs, these are the yardage counts that they have accumulated. You ready for this? Chicago Bears running backs combined for 149. San Francisco, 135. Pittsburgh, 122. Los Angeles Rams, 226. Houston, 112. Atlanta, 139. In what universe does DeAndre Swift not surpass 69.5 rushing yards? I think this is an automatic, and this is why I'm continuing to suggest it in this overall regard. Let's go ahead and let's move on to another player that we talked about earlier today, Evan Engram. Evan Engram, let's go, we have Evan McPherson there, but let's go ahead and make it there. Here we go. So 52.5 receiving yards. I think this is a very attainable number, primarily because of what we talked about earlier today. CJ Beathard, in last week's game, in the absence of Trevor Lawrence, came in 15 passing attempts, 8 targets in the direction of Evan Engram. Not only that, earlier this season, in the Monday night game against the Cincinnati Bengals, in which, of course, Trevor Lawrence left of the injury, in that absence, 10 passing attempts from CJ Beathard, 4 of them in the direction of a guy like Evan Engram. If he's going to continue to get himself a 40-50% target share within this offense, I'm expecting a lot of success, and 52.5 receiving yards should be a very achievable number. Now, to go ahead and close out today's Pick'em overall section, I want to talk about Brandon Ayuk taking on one of the best matchups at the wide receiver position. We've talked about this ad nauseum. The Washington Commanders cannot stop a soul. And their number 1 cornerback this week, Benjamin St-Juste, is going to be inactive due to a concussion. Therefore, Brandon Ayuk, 68.5 receiving yards, in my opinion, is that's not what I wanted to do, is a very achievable number, especially considering everyone has dominated against this defense. Let's just mention a couple performances of wide receivers who play against this defense as of late. Garrett Wilson last week, 76. Cooper Kupp, 111. Tyreek Hill, 157. Brandon Cook, 72. Darius Slayton, 82. DK Metcalf, 98. Tyler Lockett in the same game, 92. There is potential for success here. I'm assuming that Brandon Ayuk could very easily surpass that number. So those are 5 overall plays that I like going into this week. There are many of other plays that you can go ahead and check out via Underdog Fantasy right now. Again, there's a link down in the description. Use code Andrew. Put together a couple pick'em slips going into this weekend's games. Enjoy the games besides, playing your overall fantasy. And you can also potentially draft some teams for the, Chris Olave is not a bad play either. Tampa Bay's defense can't stop a soul. I think maybe the 11.15 fantasy point, this might be it too. Either way, Chris Olave is another good play as a, kind of honorable mention. But either way, if you guys are interested, check it out. Put together some slips. Maybe draft some teams for the NFL playoffs because that is always fun in terms of best ball. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be back tomorrow, live streaming in the afternoon prior to the Dallas and Detroit game. Until then, I'll see you guys. Peace.